Hello, welcome to the first webinar of 2022 in our Ripple Tech Conversation series. And super happy to have Kelsey Finch here from the Senior Counsel of the Future of Privacy Forum to talk about what we're calling smart cities, connected cities, integrated systems in cities, urban tech. And so let me first introduce Kelsey and then we'll get right to our discussion. So Kelsey, who I really am always happy when I see Kelsey's name on conference calls or workshops, because she's always I think has sort of really practical and sage takes on sort of the personal privacy, collective privacy, and the intersection of privacy and cities. She is, as I said, Senior Counsel at the Future of Privacy Forum and works out of Seattle, Washington. Kelsey leads FPF's projects on smart cities and communities, data de-identification, ethical data sharing, and research. And last year, she worked with city officials on Seattle's first open data risk assessment. And I know Kelsey's in the trenches with a lot of communities and cities on sort of how to deal with urban data. I was reminded of a article that Kelsey wrote with Omer Tene in 2014, which really was very early on the scene on smart cities. Welcome to the Metropticon, protecting privacy in a hyper-connected town. So hopefully we'll have a chance, Kelsey, to sort of look at what you foresaw and then what's come to be. Kelsey is also an adjunct professor at Penn State Law School. So she's with us in the academy. Before coming to FPF, Kelsey was the inaugural Weston Fellow at the International Association of Privacy Professionals. And she's a graduate of Smith College and the Cardozo Law School. So welcome, Kelsey.
Thanks so much for having me, Ellen. I'm delighted to be here.
That's great. So let's just start with that 2014 piece. So in 2014, you were forecasting some of the tensions that, I think we've all seen now, the tensions between cities trying to provide better services, deal with, all kinds of intensifying urban problems, especially around climate mitigation and refugees and population shifts. Those are all going to be magnified with the infrastructure spending, the tensions between those efforts, and then surveillance risks, privacy risks, equity, distributional risks that come with data aggregation and use. And so you had identified these tensions. You wrote about the value of tech in cities for sustainability and transit and services. And I specifically want to call out one thing that you talked about and then get you to sort of comment on how you saw it in 2014 and where we are now. So using Tim O'Reilly's kind of city as platform verbiage, you sort of described, I would say not normatively favorably, but just as a descriptor, you described city functions that seem to be verticals, right? Like the smart grid, transit, water, education, public safety. They seem to be verticals, but what the city as platform does is it sort of takes all that data, it integrates that data. And so what the city actually is a unified data platform that's then providing services separately through disparate apps. So if you can sort of talk about how you saw it then and what's happening now.
Yeah, no, thank you for the opportunity to dive back into that. It has been a while since I tried to think about where we were back in 2014. Seems so long ago now. But it was early stages, and I think that we've in some ways come quite far from that, but in some ways we're still right back where we were at that point in time. So at least when I'm thinking about, cities as platforms, I think a lot of those, I think we've seen the technologies prove that out in a lot of ways, but we're also starting to see some of the places where that integration of data, the privacy concerns are becoming more visible to folks. They're drawing more attention, and we're starting to get more of that tension in the public conversation about whether it is appropriate to combine all of these data sources. And how do you do that in a way that's got appropriate levels of governance attached to it, recognizing that data can be sensitive in some contexts, and not in others, and that it can be personal in some contexts and not in others, and that it can be really hard to have a sort of universal approach to this, to all of the data and all of the systems that are flowing and that are keeping our city structures moving day to day. I think there's more and more data that we're seeing integrated as new technologies are introduced, as more connectivity enables devices to come online in places that we would have never have thought about them before. And then on the one hand, as we introduce more technology, I think there's a concern, or at least I have a concern, that we're going to start to flatten them out. We're going to start to see them all a little bit in sort of just one size fits all unisex approach to data that I don't think is quite appropriate, because the context matters so much. And so what we are seeing, though, is that people are starting to grapple with some of those ways that maybe you want to keep some barriers between the data flows, but you want to be able to integrate data, but maybe you only want to do that with aggregated data, or you want to have limited access for certain use cases. And I think that we're getting more sophisticated in that conversation, which is great. But the other part of that we were thinking about, sort of outside of just the pure, the data and technology coming together into sort of a common pool, is that we're thinking about, and sort of the governance challenges that come along with that, and the privacy challenges that come along with that, is that really one of the things that I was thinking about back then, I'm even more convinced of now, is the way that this does give cities some of those platform powers that we see from app stores and from others. It gives them an opportunity to, it's sort of a forcing function on their privacy and their governance, and then it lets them share that out to the ecosystem. So acting as a platform in the way that they can require certain privacy commitments and require standards of the vendors who are going to plug into their platform, and in the ways that they're making data available to people, that if they can allow privacy protections to flow with the data, that's actually a really powerful position for the city and for that sort of platform function to be, in some ways, raises some challenges for privacy, but potentially an opportunity as well to help centralize.
Let me ask you a question about that, about sort of relative power between, and of course it's going to depend on the city, but just hearing you say that, the first thing that occurs to me is I've heard from city officials, or sometimes these are just tech advocates saying, well, actually the city can't attach too many strings, tie too many strings to procurement or vendor agreements, because it just won't get good vendors. They won't play. Or I've also heard it in the context of trade secrets, right? If there's a requirement that that this technology be, pretty seriously transparent, then you won't get, the good guys or the attractive companies to play.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a concern. I hear the same thing every day from folks in these spaces, and it's interesting because that is the path that most of the privacy sort of structure is coming through these days. We see folks passing surveillance ordinances that are really about forcing transparency and accountability at the procurement stage. We see people updating their contract terms to be really focused on privacy and security in a way that they never have, and to roll those out citywide rather than department by department. We see a lot of focus also on people have gotten clever about procurement. Sometimes that means donating technologies. Sometimes that means doing revenue sharing. And so we're seeing those also getting swept in. We're seeing broader and broader definitions of what constitutes the kinds of data or technology that needs to be pushed through these sorts of systems, whether or not it's sort of the traditional procurement model. And it is really powerful. I think that more than anything, it does slow down the process. It makes it harder to get technologies implemented. And I know that causes frustration for a lot of folks who just want to go out and do, and I appreciate that concern. But I do think that it also, by taking that pause to reflect on what the technology is capable of, to think about its potential impacts and unintended consequences before it's deployed, that's a really powerful mover for privacy, and that's sort of the way that we like privacy to work in enterprises of all shapes and sizes. But it also, I think, prevents folks from having to roll back technologies that maybe they were a little too hasty on. We've seen cities sink a ton of money, hundreds of millions of dollars in the sensor networks that they then had to come back in a couple of years and pull out because of their impacts on civil liberties, because of their impacts on privacy, or just because they didn't work. And so hopefully we're getting
what kinds of sensor networks were those that they had to pull out?
Yeah, I think I've heard of a couple. So some of the CCTV camera networks I know have caused lots of heartache. I think San Diego has been going through these in the last couple of years, but also things like mesh networks that were intended to increase connectivity around a city, but may have incidentally been picking up MAC addresses and therefore enabled sort of real-time location surveillance of individuals in a way that wasn't intended. And so we're seeing, cities have to grapple. Sorry for my cat bomb. Have to grapple with what it means to go too fast and break things, as opposed to being a little bit slower and a little bit more methodical, but then having a more sustainable process. And I have the really hokey thing that I try to convince all of my cities of is that, right, brakes are on a car to help make you go faster. They give you control over your speed. And so my pitch is that privacy and privacy safeguards are there to help your innovation go faster in much the same way that it gives you a little bit more control over what you're doing. So I don't know if I've sold people, but that's my pitch to them.
I think that's a really good sobriquet. Would that be the right word for all of lawyers? Because, I just think, the role you're describing is kind of all lawyers talking to in these systems, right, are the ones that are trying to slow things down and sort of often say no, and they can be a thorn in the side of city officials who are, who are just trying to make things happen. And that sort of, I think we're at the stage where the privacy concerns can sometimes feel that way, whether they're, biometric bans or simply procurement conditions. And so I appreciate that the brakes are there to help the car run. So one thing you said, another thing that I think one of your proposals in that 2014 paper that I thought was really interesting and I haven't seen a lot about, and I wanted to ask you about, was it's something you called featurization. And I think by that you meant, to the extent that cities and their partners are gathering a lot of data, in addition to making the processes transparent, in addition to de-identification and privacy protection, let's make sure that whether we've talked about that there isn't a good word for this, citizens, residents, people in the city, let's make sure that they realize some of the value so that whether it's Fitbit, I think you used the example of Fitbit data, but sensor network data or smart grid data, how can it not just be good for the businesses that are using it, the city that's providing services, but actually people can start doing creative things with the data, urban data, or anonymized or even personally identifiable information. How can they turn it into a feature for themselves? So have you seen that, and do you still think that's a good idea?
Yeah, so I definitely have not seen any uptake on that word that we threw out there. It's definitely rejected on Featurized. Perhaps correctly, it does seem a little bit too commercial for the context of the smart city. But I do see that same that need is there. And I think this is one of the things that folks are really struggling with, is to make sure that the services that they're providing, that the technologies that cities are using, are serving a real need in the community, and that they're going to give something tangible back in exchange for the data that they are using. And I think that that's something that we haven't always seen a matchup on, where the community's priorities and the technology that were available don't always align up. You get sort of that problem of, I was looking for my car keys under the streetlight instead of where I dropped them down the road. And that remains a pretty pressing challenge, I think. There are lots of small community organizations, I think, doing some of this, trying to do more of this effort. It's a lot attached to the open data movement, I think, where they're sort of, you can use the data that comes out of the cities as sort of like a raw material to do interesting, innovative things. But I've also really appreciated circumstances where like the Array of Things in Chicago, which was sort of one of the original smart cities installations. What they would do is that they would take some of the sensors themselves, some of the data flows off of them, and they'd provide them to the local science, like high school. And so the students would get to do their own experiment with these devices
Wow.
in their own neighborhoods. They get to see and use the data to be educated, to innovate. And I think that kind of tangible hands-on experience and impact with the technologies themselves and with the data is really valuable. And I'd like to see more and more cities think about this sort of participatory, meaningful engagement, not just with the decision making about what's an appropriate use and where's the technology go and what technology should be used or not, but also, you know, trying to get some value out of it, because I think we want to make sure that it's not that one-way data flow of value from individuals and communities to the government, and then sort of a really disparate, your public services are slightly more efficient, maybe your tax bill goes down someday. Like, it's hard to have that kind of a connection. I think privacy risks can be hard to understand until they're really tangible, and the data benefits are really hard to understand until they're really tangible. And we need to make sure that those are accruing equitably and that they're accruing in a way that people can see and appreciate and feel, because that's how you get buy-in. That's how you get the community to value these services, rather than, you know, just sort of see them as totally disconnected from their day-to-day lives. And I think that helps make people much more comfortable with the technologies, much more willing to make that trade-off of data for services, but also gives them that level of insight and accountability, so that they can make sure that, you know, it is within something that they feel is appropriate for their own communities. But it is a challenging, it's one of those places where I hope that we'll see more work done, but maybe not as much to date as I would have hoped back in 2014.
Although I love that example about the schools, because extracting data from schools and students is now, you know, it is such a problem and such a point of contention, you know, sort of to the extent that that becomes the poster child of smart city innovations. It's a really bad thing. And so here you're talking about returning data to STEM, right? To STEM education. So I think that's a really interesting paradigm. I wanted to ask, so you'd mentioned Seattle, and if you could talk a little bit about what your experience was like there, what the challenges were in terms of getting, you know, better data governance, and also, you know, maybe a little bit about the personnel, not obviously not specifically, but about, you know, what kinds of positions do you know, are responsible? Is a privacy officer? Is it within the departments? Is it, you know, the chief information officer, the CTO sometimes, you know, the tech person who's responsible for these? And then, you know, I'm piling a lot on you, but maybe also we can hear not just about Seattle, but how it differs in different places.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I was really, you know, really blessed to have the opportunity to come in and work with Seattle a couple of years ago to develop, as you said, sort of a privacy risk assessment for, and to create the methodology, which by create, we really just stole from NIST, which is great because that makes it interoperable, but to sort of tailor it to the open data context, and to think both about how cities can make publication decisions about what kinds of data they're going to be releasing in a way that accounts for privacy, that accounts for the risk of re-identification and other kinds of equity and community impacts. And then also to think about how to evaluate sort of the privacy program that open data program sat within, and to give that sort of a maturity modeling. So that's actually, we've done this for a couple of cities and a couple of programs now, where we try to do some of this maturity modeling and figure out, you know, where are you now? Where might you go in 5 years? And what is that all cities are pretty, like, this is very new to all of our local governments. This is, I think, the first privacy programs in the US in a city or in a municipal city or county level, I think stretch only back to 2013, 2014. And one of those was Seattle. So I think they're actually a really interesting example. They are one of the, you know, if I could give out gold stars and medals in this space, I think Seattle is definitely one of the places that I would be giving it to, in part because they have done, so when we were coming in for the open data assessment, it was still quite early. They are a federated system. So each department is typically in charge of running its own, you know, deciding which data sets they're going to release on open data, deciding how they're going to, what gets run up through a privacy review process. But they were in the process of centralizing. And in the intervening years, they've continued to centralize more and more. And so now they got a really strong and robust privacy function with Ginger Armbruster, who's their chief privacy officer, does an amazing job. And I think now runs open data and public records and the surveillance program and the privacy program and many more things. But it's interesting to think about the sort of the growth of the privacy function and to see where it started quite narrow and it's just grown and grown and grown, because all of these things are interconnected. It's really hard to make choices about how to protect and safeguard privacy while having an open data program releasing a bunch of information, while having a public records program releasing a bunch of information. You really need them all within, or you don't have to, but it's great to have them all within one tent. And it's interesting to see that did start within sort of the chief technology officer's home, the IT department, but Seattle went through a centralizing process over the, in sort of a really deliberate way on the basis of recommendations from a variety of organizations, as well as sort of just the internal natural growth. There was a big push. They passed a surveillance ordinance a couple of years ago that is especially prescriptive and requires a lot of documentation and public.
Yeah, how's that going? How's that going? Because that is, I've heard mixed things about it.
Yeah, so I think that if you talk to the folks in Seattle, they'll probably recommend that the model being used out of Oakland and Santa Clara and other places is perhaps a little bit more effective or efficient, just because they're less prescriptive, that you can get the difference between a 400-page review that takes 9 months to complete as opposed to a 4-page review that takes a couple of months, and everything in between depending on the details of the technology. But they do have a resourced team. They've got 4 or 5 full-time privacy professionals, which is unheard of at the local level. Everyone else in the country is maybe one full-time person, maybe one part-time person, somebody who stuck their neck out and said, this is interesting, and then suddenly the whole the whole system came to their front door to see what they can do. And so it's really interesting. So I get the benefit of, I coordinate what we call the Civic Privacy Leaders Network, right? Which is, we got some National Science Foundation funding. We set up a peer network for people who do privacy in local government, whether it's in their title or not. And so we've been meeting for the last couple of years where people can just compare notes and say what works, what doesn't, how are you thinking about this technology? And this sort of structural resourcing is the one thing that over and over and over, people have good ideas for what they need to accomplish. It's how to operationalize it, and how to operationalize it within the unique context of a city, because there are different pressures than we would see. You can't just copy paste a enterprise privacy program from a major company and drop it into local government. The need to wrestle with public records laws, the need to wrestle with equity is a much more serious consideration, and has much bigger consequences if you get it wrong. The different legal requirements and environments and sort of the relationship that people have with their city is so different than what they would have with a company. There's a lot to deal with, and so I definitely feel for the folks who are doing this on the ground. But so to roll all the way back to your question, I think they all wear a lot of hats. It's a part-time therapist, part-time privacy expert, part-time tech expert. Do a lot with CISOs and the security side of the team, although they're not usually the same person, just because the split in expertise and for now, the security side still seem a little bit more well-resourced than privacy. But a lot of law, a lot of social services, a lot of human rights departments all coming together sort of within the umbrella of privacy, which is, I think, really fascinating.
So in that connection, so we've talked about silos, we've talked about horizontal sharing and data governance, and I think you had mentioned there's a lot more attention to being paid, and one of your objectives is to get them to think about how do you treat different kinds of data differently, how do different functions in the city protect, decide not to share or share under certain conditions. Okay, and then there's the police, and I think that we see over and over that there are sort of intentions to use data in a certain way, and that's what's been announced to the public. I mean, you can think about transit, or you can think about smart streetlights. And yet, when the police say there's an emergency, they either, go in and get the data by using a warrant, or they go in and get the data through some other sort of data sharing process within the city. So what do you think about that? And what, in a sense that undermines public trust in any kind of declaration about how data is going to be used, and it makes people nervous about any kind of data collection, and it leads people to say we just have to have data minimization because there's no way to restrict sharing when it comes to the cops. I don't know, and I guess there are people who say something else. So help us with that.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting, and I really, I think maybe more now we've seen a convergence, but especially if we're looking back to 2014 and sort of the years following, there really were two different paths for smart cities. And there were sort of the smart cities that were Internet of Things, seemed more exciting and probably more benign, but people weren't thinking about it in a law enforcement context. There was like, oh, well, maybe if we have audio sensors, there could be something, but like, we'll kick that down the road. And it was really that side of the thing seemed a little bit sunnier than the other route, which was much more focused on law enforcement technologies and surveillance technologies. And you still sometimes see like a split between privacy and surveillance programs within cities or within the scholarship and the conversations. I think that's interesting to tease out. I do think that we're starting to see them come back together, which makes more sense because, as you said, the data sharing capacity between those two is in some cases extraordinarily easy and sometimes quite murky, and that makes it really challenging. I think that this is a place where I do see the surveillance ordinances that cities are passing, which can be quite restrictive, are our response to that lack of trust. They are. And the reason that they define surveillance so broadly, and they define it extremely broadly, photocopy machines fall within the definition of surveillance in many of these places, is because of that concern that people were trying to get too clever, that law enforcement would have access to things that people hadn't put enough safeguards in place because they just didn't think of it as traditionally that sort of law enforcement world. And so we're seeing a restriction on all things because of that lack of trust, because there is that lack of transparency and in many cases accountability. And so we're seeing some interesting things. The thing that I actually really like about the surveillance ordinances is the window they give us into how they've been working, because most of them are doing annual reports. We've got a couple of cities that have been doing them for long enough now that you can look at those and you could get a sense for how often the technology is actually used by law enforcement. What kinds of crimes has it been used to solve? And are those the ones that we thought they would be used for? And did it have the effectiveness rate that we thought it would when we put them into place? And do we need to reconsider them? There are still concerns about accountability and folks going around them or hiding things. I think that's a broader conversation that we're still working our way through. But it's interesting. One of the other things that I've seen that really struck me was LADOT was doing some transportation mobility data specification work, and they released principles a couple of years ago. And as one of those, they committed to doing a transparency report about how often the law enforcement were requesting this information, how often they turned it over, how often federal authorities or immigration authorities were. And like this is a borrowing from the private sector, and I thought that was really interesting. That even if there weren't,
really
structural or legal ways to completely cut that off, because we want some level of, if people go through due process, you don't want a complete and total firewall in case of emergency or in places where it would have been appropriate. But to have due process requirements and to have transparency about that, I think was powerful and is an important step towards wherever this is going. But it is definitely, that is I think sort of the third rail of a lot of these conversations is just there's a fundamental lack of trust that the data won't be used against people in particularly law enforcement or immigration contexts, at least here in the US.
That's so Kelsey, that's so interesting about the surveillance ordinance annual reports. It makes me think I have to read them. Do you have any? I mean, what have you seen?
Yeah, so there's, I think we're still pretty early in getting the results on those. It's been a couple of years. I know that BART is routinely held up as like the gold star one, which is amazing. One, it cracks me up that BART,
that's Bay Area Rapid Transit.
The transportation system has its own surveillance ordinance, which is not usually right when we're talking about surveillance. People are usually thinking law enforcement, and if I could wave my wand, I would want them also to think about transportation, because I think that's the next place where we see all of this starting to come to a head. And it's an interesting space, and there's slightly different equities than pure policing, but there's a lot of data, there's a lot of interesting things going around there. And so I think they've been doing a really good job of highlighting and documenting exactly what's been going on and how, and being honest about when technologies aren't that effective or aren't that aren't living up to what they were promised, and allowing then the city and the council to have a conversation about whether it's still worth putting all of that money into these particular technologies. Or maybe it turns out that we limited it on functionality, and what we really needed was access to one more slice of data. And that we kept running into the same hurdle over and over again. And so I think that it's really, I like the line of evidence-based policymaking. I like creating some of those records and allowing us to have a little bit more, information while we're making these policy decisions about which technologies to use, which ones not to. But I do know that there are also, there's a lot of paper that comes out, and one of the hardest things is trying to condense really complicated technologies into smaller reports that our elected officials and our public members of the public can digest, can understand, and can have sophisticated, or can at least have meaningful decisions over it. There's really hard sometimes to get the detailed information out of the vendors that you need. It's a unique skill set to be able to do some of this stuff, and I think that we don't quite have the expertise in local government that we want to yet. But hopefully we're going to have a pipeline of talented folks coming out of law schools and graduate programs and technical programs, and hopefully we'll get people who just engage in this more day to day to want to be part of the solution within their local communities.
Yeah, well, that's what. First of all, I should remind our listeners that you can put Q&As into the Q&A. So let's see, we have about 13 minutes left. I want to ask you a couple more questions, and then Kelsey, I want to turn to sort of your personal journey and how you got from Smith College to where you are now.
Sure.
Okay, so I guess, so you were talking about developing leadership in this area, and I know that that your organization is also trying to become a clearinghouse of best practices. What do you think citizens and NGOs, whether they're local or national or international, because a lot of this work is being done abroad. Also, I think some of the best work on smart cities and, platform cooperatives and sort of empowering people with data. But what do you think, let's just talk about people and nonprofits should be doing to advance good data governance?
Oh, that's such a great question. So I do think, yes, big kudos to all of what's going on abroad. And I steal routinely from elsewhere and try to, get interesting ideas and get things flowing here in the US. I think a large part of it is that we want folks to feel engaged, like there's sort of a dearth of civic participation across the board, not just in data and technology these days. I think there's a resignation about government's capacity to change and to reflect the values of the community. And I want people to, even in the face of that resignation, to engage and to show up to council meetings where where new technologies are being discussed, or to raise the question if you see an interesting sensor on the sidewalk, reach out through social media, reach out through whatever the government platforms and channels are. You ask questions about it, ask about what's going on a privacy perspective, and see what's happening with your data. I think it's your right to know and to get to have some say over it. I think there's a role then for nonprofits and community organizations and cities themselves to build that literacy, to give people the tools to ask those questions and to be able to make informed choices about what's going on in these spaces, and to recognize that a lot of people's experiences with data and privacy are going to be informed by what's going on in the private sector, because it's a little bit more visible in their day-to-day. Even though they have probably just as many touch points with government data collection, people don't think about it in the same way. It feels a little less, it's a little more under the radar, or it feels a little bit more benign, it just, people don't think that they have choices. And I think that we need to help overcome some of those education challenges. We want to give people the tools to ask the questions and to understand what they need to understand, to feel more comfortable with what's going on and to make choices. We also need to give them ways to be in the room. So I really want to encourage, there's a lot of folks who are doing great work in terms of public engagement and communications around these things. there was a really great project that actually did spun out of the Sidewalk Toronto debacle, but the digital transparency for the public realm, or I think it's called Helpful Places now, but was creating sort of an iconography and a visual language of data collection for public spaces. I thought that was amazing. And I'd love to see things like that, or Boston has a Beta Blocks project where they were working with neighborhoods in a really intentional way to understand how to help communities with this technology rather than just force the technology upon them. I think that it will require some work from both sides, some willingness to build relationships and to build trust. But I think that that's a really powerful place for folks to start to build in on that and to lean on.
Yeah, I didn't know the name had changed to Helpful Places, and I think
Yeah.
my mind has changed about that. Like when that was first proposed, so these are sort of icons that would be attached to a camera or a sensor, in real space, and it would say what data is being collected, where the data is going, what kind of data it is. And at first I thought, that sort of is like notice when there's no possible consent, right? Because you can't avoid the spaces that you're walking through. But I've now come in, to see actually that part of its utility is just to engage people and get them to ask those questions, right? And to interrogate the signs and push back on the data collection and use, but also to really become sensitized to how much data is actually being collected. So all right, so let me ask you, Kelsey, what brought you to law school? And I'm asking these questions, especially for our students who kind of wonder, like, where do I go from here? And the surprising, it's often for many of us, where we are is not where we expect it to be. And so if that's true for you, maybe you can share that with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I went to law school as sort of a last case resort. I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, and I can buy 3 years by going to law school and come out with a tangible skill set that if nothing else, I can hang a shingle and do some contract work and I can figure it out from there. And in part because my alternative, I was really seriously thinking about going and getting a degree in Asian history, but I didn't want to learn both French and German. So I gave up out of laziness and decided law school would be the easier path. And I'm not totally sure that that was correct, but it certainly opened a lot of new doors. And I didn't go in knowing that policy was a field that existed. I didn't know that privacy was a field that existed. And I got really lucky to find both during my time there. So that's
right. Well,
into law school.
I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to your career path, but we have a question from Alex. From my understanding, Singapore was one of the first cities to implement surveillance to optimize transportation. What hurdles do you see the US having in implementing a similar system? And do you see the deployment of autonomous vehicles as a complication or benefit to decreasing traffic congestion in urban areas?
Ooh, those are great questions. I don't know that I've got really sophisticated answers on them, but I can say that from the data perspective, I think the complications of autonomous, so I think the capacity for collecting non-personal information in transportation context is really interesting because a lot of it becomes personal information surprisingly quickly, and that really complicates the legal framework and the data governance. And the extent to which location data is so inherently personal that it becomes extremely easy to re-identify individuals. And then you're opening the door to a tremendous amount of legal compliance and regulatory challenges to just in terms of how much you need to do to make sure that you're protecting the data. I think there's an interesting, we're seeing an evolution in terms of data sharing in transportation spaces, which I think is useful. I think we're starting to, it's good for the urban planning, it's good for the environmental science, it's good for understanding the impacts of these technologies and be able to better predict and deploy them. But again, I care for
the sharing. Where is the sharing? Who is the sharing between?
Yeah, so we're seeing sharing between public and private sector, which is interesting. We're seeing cities forcibly collect data out of electronic scooters and e-bikes, out of Ubers and Lyfts where they can get them, and especially out of autonomous vehicles. So that's an interesting flow of data. If you are a person in a vehicle who's not necessarily expecting your private vehicle trip to be communicated to the government and put into a government database to do transportation planning. That can sometimes surprise and upset people. There are safeguards that one can think about putting in place and ways to mitigate those concerns, but it's definitely, that flow of information is slightly different than what we expect. And so that raises challenges. We're also seeing lots of aggregation of data and data shared between local, state, federal, international, with nonprofits, with academic researchers. There's a lot of data flows here that, again, we need to be thoughtful about safeguarding and protecting people's privacy at each of these stages. So it gets complicated. I'm not sure that AVs are ever going to uncomplicate anything, just because they're putting out so much information, and they require, and it makes it hard, right? We think about privacy safeguards and privacy by design safeguards. And, one of the easy solutions is, well, okay, if they have, they have all these sensors and cameras on them, so just blur faces in the same way that we do for Google Maps. But it turns out that the car really needs to see where that person's eyes are pointing to know if there's a potential collision, if they're looking down at the road, if they're looking away, if they're looking straight at it. So you can't really just blur the whole face. You need to, so it just gets more and more complicated from a technical layer as well as a sort of a legal and governance layer. But I think it's definitely a place to be watching. This is where I think a lot of the innovation is going to be happening in our smart cities contexts.
So interesting. Alex, I'll put in a plug for Anthony Townsend's book called Ghost Road, which is all about the future of AVs. Okay, so last question, because I get this a lot from students, Kelsey, which is about professional certifications in privacy. So you've got the International Association of Privacy Professionals, SIP and SIPM, after your name. So tell us a little bit about, or tell the students especially about, are these valuable and worth it?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll do a shameless plug for folks who are looking to get into the privacy space. There's a lot of fellowships that one can pursue that I think are tremendously valuable. They give you a lot of insight into what the many ways to be a privacy person, and the organizations that do it to build those relationships, because it's not a huge community. It's a great way to get to know people. But the certifications are the other thing that I do recommend. And it's not a strictly must-have, but I think it's really useful as a way to signal that you've put in some time and some effort to get the basics under your belt, and to indicate that you care about this as a profession, that it's not just, it looked okay that I had an opportunity to submit a resume, but you can use that, you can stack that on top of papers and classes, internships, externships, other sorts of volunteer opportunities to demonstrate your knowledge and your skill sets coming into the space. I think it's something that I see when I started in privacy almost 10 years ago. It really, really made you stand out from the crowd. Today, I think it's a little bit more expected, but I also see it in job postings today, where it's a requirement, or it's effectively a requirement. So it does help you get into, I think, that next level of being part of the conversation. And it's not, there are ways to do it. If anybody wants to do these, the secret trick is just buy the books for $60. Don't do the $500 training. Apologies to IAPP for that one. But I think, it's worth doing. Not all of them are, not all certification programs are the same, but I think in the privacy space, it does help you stand out. And it's a good way to get the basics. If you don't have a privacy class available to you, if you don't have an opportunity to do the hands-on learning up front, they actually do go through and give you the foundations for everything that you're going to need to know to succeed in this field. So
Great.
I do approve of them.
Okay. I do too. Last question, because I want to answer all the questions. Ed asks, given that White House OSTP is doing an AI Bill of Rights, what do you think about sort of national universal minimum standards for data sharing and privacy?
Oh, I would love that. That would be amazing. That would make a lot of lives easier. I don't think it's incredibly likely. We've been trying to get federal agreement on the commercial side of government of data regulation for a couple of decades now, and we're not quite there. I think that, but if we could get alignment on definitions, on core concepts, on some of those baseline standards, it really would help accelerate a lot of different spaces. I think the challenge here is that we see a lot of interest in consumer protection here in the US, but not as much in government regulation, which is why in the meantime, not much happening at the federal level on these sort of the day-to-day or sort of the technology development that will impact smart cities, but a lot going on locally that's flying under the radar. So I think really interesting time to look at both levels and to see the divergence perhaps in our future paths here.
All right. Kelsey, thank you. Great
Thank
to
you.
have you. Thanks, everyone.